Welcome to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. This podcast is all about conversations about healing and rising from the ashes of your grief and trauma. In this podcast, we will be deconstructing and highlighting the different aspects of grief and loss. I'm your host, Dr. Christina Zampatella. Welcome to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. We have a really important topic we're going to be talking about today, which is reproductive loss. And I want to thank Kate Suarez for coming again to talk about a very important topic associated with reproduction, as we just got done doing an episode on being a stillbirth doula. So hopefully people have had a chance to take a look at that, or will be taking a look at that afterwards. And I just want to thank you again for your coming and talking about a topic that is a very sensitive topic for a lot of families, and looking forward to learning a little bit more about this. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background, about what your educational background is, and what what you do for a living, and just try to give a little bit of background about where you're coming from in regard to working with families with reproductive loss.
Okay. So currently I work as an LCSW at a major hospital system, and then also at an independent location, working primarily with the transgender population, but then also a lot of grief and loss work. I got my master's from Simmons University. I always plug them because I loved it. And I worked for a long time in maternal child social work, which led me to specialize in being with families who had experienced reproductive loss. So that might have been miscarriage, stillbirth, death of a baby in the NICU. And because it was social work, I got to do a lot of helping them with kind of the detailed stuff that's hard to deal with. Like we talked about, like, how do we call a funeral home? How do we decide, like, what if to cremate or not? And just being with families during that time, and also providing like bereavement counseling through trying to do all the details too. So, and I learned to really love that piece of it, and it kind of led me to like, okay, how can I have like sort of grief and loss be like a primary part of my sort of like therapeutic stance, because it's like definitely where my heart is. And I'm also, if you listen to the previous podcast, a stillbirth doula. So that that education is like all about reproductive loss of like every kind, and how you can be with families during that time and walk alongside them and support them in ways that there's not really like a role that's like that.
Mm-hmm. And you're also working in private practice on a little bit on the side with the Center for Grief and Trauma Therapy, which I'm the founder and owner of that. And so I poached you for that.
Yes, I'm so glad.
I'm so glad as well. So this is a topic that is, first of all, finding a couples therapist is like wrangling kittens. It's already very challenging, and once you find one, often they're already full and you can't get onto their caseload. So we already know that that's challenging. Then you add in reproductive loss, which I want to talk about the different kinds of reproductive loss, how we define that. But finding one that actually can specialize in that's I've been in this field for 30 years. I've been in the field of mental health for 30 years. I've specialized in this for almost 20 years. You just don't find people who are doing that kind of work. And so I guess I'd really like to kind of dive into that, because as much as you can have couples therapists that say, yes, I've worked with a lot of grieving, parents, that doesn't mean that they're actually a trained thanatologist, or thanatologist being a specialist in death, loss, and grief. So you've got a combination and skill set that is one of the most unique I've ever come across. So I appreciate the fact that you're willing to take time, here with us today.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit first about how do we define what reproductive loss is?
Right. And there's just so many things. So first we think of the basics that most people can come up with, right? Miscarriage, stillbirth, baby dies in the NICU. and yet there's so many more. There's infertility being its own reproductive loss. There's loss of what you thought you would have if you have a baby who's born with like any type of developmental disability. There's, like we talked about, choosing to not have children, like, and the sometimes judgment that comes with that. There's termination for medical reasons, there's elective terminations, like all of those are reproductive loss, and they come with their own grief process. With each one of these, you're generally dealing with judgments from others, so it's kind of like layer upon layer upon layer of losses when you dive into reproductive loss.
Why do you think there's so much judgment around it?
You know, when people like can't understand something, they like need to blame someone. Like with stillbirth, for example, when they don't know why it happened, like other couples will sometimes be like, oh, well, they must have done this, because otherwise they worry it could happen to them, right? If you acknowledge that, like, sometimes this just happens, then it could just happen to you. And our brains are not wired to like accept that possibility. So it's like this almost like instinctual, like, well, what did they do to have that happen to them? And like, as the grieving family, you can kind of feel that. And going into like your disenfranchised loss podcast, like can be very disenfranchising, like the reproductive loss.
I think that there's also, not only is there judgment from other people and self-judgment and the disenfranchisement from the people around them, from the people in the medical community. Absolutely. Which I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story on that one that happened to me, which pissed me off to the highest of festivity. But then, but also this like lack of self-compassion,
yeah,
especially if there's a question about whether or not there was something wrong with me that happened. Like, was there something genetically wrong with me that made this, this child die in utero? Like what's happening, and what does it mean to choose to be child-free? And am I going to regret that later on? And my family, I mean, there's so many different aspects of it, for sure.
Yeah.
When I was 28, 29 years old, I got pregnant. And I miscarried. And when I miscarried, I went to the doctor, and the doctor, and this is before I was like really understanding. I would have handled this way differently now. I would have walked out and chased his ass down the hallway. But he said to me, 1 in 3 pregnancies end up in miscarriage. You're going to be able to have children in the future. You'll be all right. And then walked out the door. And I just sat there stunned.
Yeah.
Like, dude, there was a whole thing.
Yeah.
Like, I was choosing names. I was trying to figure out how I could turn my office into a nursery. Like, there was a whole thing of like, oh my God, I'm in the middle of graduate school. How am I going to do this? Like, there was so many questions. My ex-husband was in the military, so I was dealing with grief associated with like deployments and all that other stuff. So then it's like, am I going to have to do this alone?
Yeah.
And what does that look? I mean, there was so many complicating factors, and just the kind of brush it off, but what word am I looking for here? Just the kind of dismissive, the dismissiveness in the medical community, who gets less training than mental health professionals, hands down. Like, I really wish I would have known what I've known now, because if you think I'm kidding, I would have followed him. I followed doctors out of the office. There was something that happened to me with like a different like injury that I had, and he walked away, and I walked out. I'm like, how can you just walk away? Yeah. So now I'm a pain in the ass, but that's all right. I'm all right with that. Well, I mean, dude, learn. Like, come on, continuing education about how to be on the front lines here. So anyway, I got a little off track, but I mean, it's just a kind of a personal, story to illustrate just from the very get-go of this kind of like, this is normal. It's normal. It might be normal in your world. It's not normal in my world. Right. So I had this whole view of what it was going to be like to be a couple. And then this whole transitional piece of I'm going to become a family. And I had a whole reproductive story. So now I'm grieving the loss of these potential futures. Think of all the things. The loss of what it was going to be like to have the child, and what was going to be like when they went to school, and how about in the teenage years when I wanted to sell them, and all these other things that are going on in the, I mean, so just completely just undermined. So when, I don't even know where to start. There's just so many things to talk about with it. So how do you feel that, let's go with, you know, that there was a miscarriage, and we'll approach each one of these. But if there was a miscarriage or a stillbirth, how do you feel if there was a partnership or a marriage, you know, and it wasn't like a single mother? Not that that's not only disfranchised, but we're talking about infertility loss, and I'm kind of curious about couples right now. How do you feel, or what have you seen as the impact of that loss on the partnership itself?
So, as I'm sure you can imagine, like, it's like runs the whole gamut. Like, there are couples who can like grieve together, who like maybe kind of at the same pace a little bit, and they are able to communicate, and that is like amazing when you see it. But at the same time, that's not the norm because
it's not the norm.
No, and when think about it, when we choose our partner, they're usually actually not a lot like us. Like, sometimes they complement us, but then when something like that happens, like the loss of a baby, whether it's a miscarriage, a stillbirth, like there is just that, like, the we grief is so big, and seeing your loved one, like your partner, be that sad and you are that sad, it's like drowning in it. And sometimes you see, like, I'm sure you've seen this, where partners like push away or drift away because they can't hold their pain and their partner's pain, and then sometimes couples blame each other, right? Like, I told you not to work so hard, I told you to do this, even when there's no cause, right? Like, that can sometimes happen just because our brains like needing to have a reason, because we can't cope with the why if there's no reason. So, and then a lot of times, so if they end up in therapy, you see that kind of like disconnect of where they're at in their grieving process, which, as you know, goes all over the place. Like, and also kind of how they're feeling towards each other. Like, sometimes you'll see one partner, like, you need to get over this. You need to go back to work. We have a life. You need to do this. Whereas the other one's like, what do you mean? Like, our whole lives are destroyed. What are you talking about? Work? Why? For what? We have no child. What are we working for? You know what I mean? Like, really, to the point of like, we were starting a family. Now we're not. So why do I need to work? Why can't I just lay on the floor and cry? Which is a totally legitimate question.
Absolutely.
So you'll see that. But I will say, if they come to therapy, it's because they do want to work it out, right? Even if it seems like such a mess that no one's ever coming out of it alive. I feel like that's what I see the most often, is they're just kind of disconnected. Something I also see, which is really hard, is like loss of intimacy. Like, even when mom is healthy enough and feels physically healed, like the thought of having sex again, they like can't even like process that idea, because it's like they think about the baby, making a baby. It's like just in their brain nonstop. And then, or they look at their partner and they're like, all I see is the dad I thought you were going to be, and I don't even want to look at you right now. And then it's like, one of the things is like, okay, you're supposed to wait X amount of time before trying again. And now we're using birth control. Like, that whole idea of like, we want to have baby, our baby is dead, and now you're telling us to take birth control. Like, goodbye. No, we're not doing this. Like, it's too much for the brain sometimes.
It's overwhelming.
So overwhelming. And the fact that people stay together at all is like a miracle.
Well, and there is a higher divorce rate or separation rate for partners when they have lost a child.
Yes, absolutely.
And when you were talking about different rates of how they're grieving and different ways of dealing with it, I've always heard that referred to as like an asynchronous grieving style or an asynchronous coping style. So when they're not able to recognize each other's grieving style or coping style, then all of a sudden there's this whole, you're not grieving the right way. When I was working with couples, and tell me if I'm wrong here, because it's been a little bit, I haven't worked with couples since before COVID. But it's also a lot about like, what do you see? Like, let's say you have somebody, sitting next to you here. What do you see with Kate in terms of the way that she's navigating her grief right now? Okay, do you understand that that's a valid way of grieving?
Right.
And to be able to recognize the grieving process in one another so that you can support the way that you're grieving and the way that you're coping, and how to identify if you're not coping well and what can I do to step in to help you. And by the way, this is what I need when I'm not doing well, and to be able to have your partner be able to say, okay, now I can see where you need help, and to become a team. Because it's like, that's the biggest thing, right? And each person has their own individual grieving process. So you're grieving as individuals, as a couple, and as this potential future that you may have had. And you may have surviving children, and those surviving children, like, how are you navigating their grief? At the same time that you're navigating this. And I'm thinking, I know I'm talking a lot right now, but I'm thinking of well, I was talking to my father, because I lost my brother Damien, and I was talking to my dad, and he was like, hey, you ought to put me on an episode. And I'm like, I might, seriously, to talk about the loss of a child, because I watched what happened between the two of them. And thankfully, they stayed together, but they weren't able to navigate my sister and I, afterwards. We were adults, and I think that they were just so bereft and so tied up into their grief that we became what was called the forgotten child, or the forgotten children. So this reproductive loss does not just end with the mother, or just end up with the father or the partner. This ripples out to families and grandparents, and I mean, again, more people that we, whatever. So I'm talking forever. So, what about when you're working with somebody who has? So we're talking about miscarriage and stillbirth right now, and we have a whole episode where we were talking about when you were you as a death doula, how to, as what you're navigating with stillbirth. So we're seeing that with the couples, right? What do we do to work with people who are navigating infertility?
Similar issues can arise, right, for the couple, because even if they don't know why they're unable to get pregnant, or if they do know and it's someone's fault, as they like to say, there's
like one person's infertile.
So there's that to navigate. But there's also, it kind of depends on okay, are we having trouble getting pregnant post-loss? Is that what's happening? And are we now, did we have a spontaneous pregnancy and now we're down the IVF road? How did this happen? That has the ability to bring couples closer together, because you have a goal, right? You are on a team. Our goal is to harvest these eggs and pick this sperm, and this is the step, and this is the step. And actually, the steps can be very helpful, because you do things in order. It's prescribed. That can be helpful. It can also just all fall apart, obviously.
It also can fall apart.
Yeah, because most of us know families who have done many rounds of IVF and it hasn't worked, either not taken or had a miscarriage. So when infertility has the capacity to almost go on much longer. And I think that part is hard because, and I know we've talked about this before, if you do get pregnant, it's hard to then have hope that the pregnancy will last until a live birth, and hard to bond with the baby because you're afraid. And you as the pregnant person are doing all that in your head, but then there's also partner who's also nervous but not carrying the baby, and everybody is having such heavy, thick emotions that the other one can't possibly understand, that when you look at it, you're surprised anybody stays together ever anyway. So
it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. And there's so much actually to learn from doing couples therapy. When you see the way couples interact and when they do functional things, you're like, oh my gosh.
What do you mean by functional things?
If you're seeing them interact in a conversation that, say it's something that they argue about all the time, or say they are down a certain blame road and shame road about the loss. Sometimes one partner will say one thing that's actually very supportive, and you'll see the other partner's face kind of change. and then they'll kind of go in a different direction. And as a therapist, you're kind of just sitting there, right? Sometimes all you do is sit there and then see them kind of work their way out of like the road they were going down. And sometimes they don't even notice, and sometimes you don't even point it out, right? Other times you can point out, like, did you see what you guys just did there? But I mean, couples work in general is super sticky and hard. And then when reproductive loss is in the mix, it's like, sometimes as a therapist, you're like, just, okay, you don't even know what's coming, but we're going to try and just get out of it the best that we can. Like, and like I said before, when they decide to come to therapy, that's like the first step. Like, you're deciding to do it, knowing it might be a long road, and knowing, like, with infertility, like, you don't know where it will end. So is it going to end in a live birth? Is it going to end in $100,000 and no baby? And kind of just the strength to be like, you know what, we're going to go for whatever outcome happens.
Yeah, that financial burden.
Yeah, because it's not even a possibility for a lot of people, right? It's like
some insurances cover it, other ones don't.
Yeah.
And it's a lot of, so many of your resources, emotional, psychological, spiritual, like, and what does it mean to you? Like, are you in, do you have a religious belief system that does not support things such as infertility treatment?
Right. Right.
And then what do you do? Do you say, okay, wait a minute, my religious belief system is this, but I really want a family, so I can't do that? Like, there's a lot of conflict that may occur that then spreads out to different, like, what do you do when there's an incongruence like that?
And also, like, that comes from family too, right? Like, you're raised a certain way, and maybe your partner was not raised that way. And so one partner's like, well, we're not destined to have biological children, so now it's time to talk about adoption. Other partners like, absolutely not. Like, that's not what we're doing. So, and it's not really the things that you think about when you get married, right? Like, you're in love, if starting a family is in your plan, like, nobody's like, so if IVF is on the table before we get married, let's talk about this.
Right.
And it really, like, it does impact whole families too, because we all know how grandparents can get into it also. And that, I see that a lot, because when there's a loss, for example, mom's mom is like grieving the grandchild, grieving like losing her daughter, because at the moment her daughter is falling apart in a puddle and crying and unable to do the things that she needs to do. So I know I like go all the way off topic and everything.
No, but these are all related.
Yeah, but it's like, and that's kind of what it is. It's like a spider web of, when these things happen, it just ripples out like everywhere. And I think the older children thing is an important distinction, because how do you even feed, like even get up and hand Cheerios to your older child when you're so devastated? And then you have to comfort the child when you feel incapable of being like waking up in the morning. And that kind of like just deep grief and what feels like meaningless loss is just, and again, it's like a disenfranchised type. And when you think about it, you talk about it, oh my God, the pain that those parents are in, people should just be like descending upon them with love and food and etc. But they don't get that. People who bring home a live baby do. So that's a whole other thing, but.
Yeah, gotcha. You know, another kind of loss I was thinking about was SIDS.
That one is so, like,
I've worked with clients who have lost their children to SIDS, and that, I mean, out of the blue.
Yeah.
Baby was healthy, and we still don't know what causes it.
Right.
So we don't have, like, what are we wrapping our head around? When you don't, I feel like, in a future episode, I'm going to be doing a interview with somebody who specializes in like meaning reconstruction, and he would say, "No, I'm super excited. It's going to be a wonderful episode." But what he often says is, "We don't live in statistics; we live in stories."
Yeah.
And if we don't have a cohesive story, we begin to fill in the blanks.
Yep. Exactly.
And you can see that with trauma a lot, which is even like you're this kind of passive witness of trauma. And I think that also comes into play here. I don't want to underestimate just how traumatic of an experience this is. This isn't, quote unquote, just grief. There's always grief and trauma. There's not always trauma and grief. But there's always grief and trauma, right? So I start thinking about, like, how are we navigating the traumatic responses? How are we filling in the blanks when there is nothing to fill it in with?
And that's what causes some of the, like, hardest, like, grief periods, and where blame comes in, self-blame, other people are blaming you. SIDS is, like, just for that reason so terrible, like, aside from the part where the baby has passed, but now you're blaming yourself, other people are blaming you, literally no one knows what happened, and it's, like, just so painful without the level of support that people need. And even if, like, your family is wonderfully supportive and they're not blaming you at all, it's so, how does one have no reason, no why, no medical diagnosis, and then be like, it's not my fault? Well, like, I just put her down to sleep, you know what I mean? Like, I was there. What do you mean it's not my fault?
That's a form of guilt, right? Is, like, it's called role guilt. As a parent, my main responsibility is to keep my children alive. And I've seen, loss by drug overdose. Obviously, I've seen that with drug overdose, but also with, clients of mine of saying, what did I do wrong? Yeah, I tried to do everything. I put him in rehab. He was in my home when he died. I was unable to save his life.
Yeah.
And that whole, like, what I do with that? And then the guilt of, how do you allow yourself to start moving forward and have happiness and potentially continue to start thinking about what it would be like if you tried again, without feeling like there's guilt associated with being allowed, quote unquote, allowed to feel happy again.
Yeah.
And does that mean you've, overlooked it? Do you name I have a million things, right? Do you name a child who's been born, but,
like
born deceased?
Yeah. And that's like all that cultural stuff.
That's
too,
all the
right?
cultural stuff.
Yeah.
Do you bury the child? I mean, there's parts of cemeteries that are for children, right?
Yeah.
But not everybody wants to do that.
No. And
there's no rituals.
Exactly.
There's no rituals for miscarriage. There's no rituals for infertility. We have rituals around death, depending on the culture. Maybe you have a viewing, and then you have the funeral, and then you have a wake after, or you're sitting
like
Shiva. And right. And so, but where are the rituals for this? Thank you for listening to Phoenix Rising with Dr. Z. If you found this podcast helpful, please share it, subscribe, and leave a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. We want to be a resource for anyone who's experiencing loss, and this is a simple way you can help us spread the word. Check out our show description. There you'll find a link to connect with me on social media, as well as helpful articles and resources.